All right, so hello and welcome everybody to RisingUp's third webinar. We're just a couple of minutes late due to tech issues, but that is the major delay in this world. As mentioned, or as it says, it will be recorded and a link will be posted afterwards. And the presentation will be hopefully about 40 minutes with 15 minutes of discussion. And then the slideshow includes links that you'll be able to click once you get access to the slideshow, which again, a link will be posted. So here we are, it's June 2017. Here's the agenda for today. We're going to first, or Gail's going to bring us into looking at what is RisingUp. Then I'll go through some of the things that RisingUp has done so far. We'll look at how things change and what's our theory of change and strategy. We'll look at our principles and values of RisingUp, and then how we can get involved. And just a few notes of introduction. My name's Stuart. I'm based in Bristol. I actually have moved to the UK from Canada in order to get involved in RisingUp, which I found out about in last October and first got involved in November, and then have been trying to do stuff with since, both in the Bristol group and sort of trying to coordinate things that work nationally. Also presenting today is Gail, who's based in Stroud. Gail's one of the founders of RisingUp, with conversations starting about 14 months ago, April, I believe it was April 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I'll pass over to Gail to let us know what is RisingUp.
Thanks, Stu. And Stu, you're also from Cheshire as well as from Canada, yeah?
I am. Yeah.
Oh, hi, Thierry. It's nice to have you, love. So RisingUp is a conversation that got going back in spring last year, and it was building up towards the summer last year between various activists in different organisations such as Occupy and Earth First, Reclaim the Power, Compassionate Revolution, Plain Stupid, a few others. And we were asking, what are we doing? Why is it not enough? Why are things not changing? Why are we still on this mad collision course with the climate catastrophe? So we've been doing research on what actually works. What do we know? There are lots of useful pieces of research in the world already about what works, and we're trying to test things out. So we're trying to move beyond a kind of bubble of just doing things because we feel like we ought to looking at doing things differently. And that's not just about what we do out in the world, it's also about how we behave as a network, how we treat each other. And certainly we've not got it right yet. And we're trying to move forward. They're just people making mistakes. It's very grassroots, but we're really like trying to do this thing differently. So we have what you'd call a theory of change. That's what we say, why we think things will change if we do things a certain way, and we're really trying to weave in new ways of doing and new ways of being around each other. Very at the heart of this really is our call for a genuine democracy, a real ability for people to have a voice, so people having real power and relevant and accurate information to guide their decisions and their thinking. We know that at the moment the media is heavily dominated by sort of biased propaganda, and underpinning that, an economy that's designed to maximise well-being and minimise harm. That's what we're saying we're calling for. We do actually have a draft manifesto, not because we want to behave like a political party, but just to say, look, there's all sorts of good ideas already about what could be done to change things. We have a strategy and we have some tactics that we're using. So in June 2017, we have about 2,000 people on our database. And if you're not already, do go on the RisingUp website and make sure you're signed up so you can get information that way. We've got about 2,700 likes on Facebook, which is another way to get information. I would say about over 200 people have participated in actions across the UK. There's a small group of 4 of us, Stu and I are 2 of them, that are part of what's called a holding group that are trying to think about how to move things forward in a good way. And we also have an online platform where we organise called Basecamp. And if people want to get more involved in the organisation of this thing, then you're very welcome to join that too. We've got local groups already in Bristol, Stroud and London, and also nascent groups or people based in Liverpool, Huddersfield, Hebden Bridge, and we have a Rising Up North Facebook page in that way. Manchester, Oxford, Edinburgh, and this thing seems to be growing. There was a great meeting in Cardiff and Birmingham last night, for example. So that's who we are at the minute. And I'll speak more about our theory of change shortly. So back to Stu to tell us what we've actually been doing.
All right. So who has risen up so far? The way I heard about this, and I mentioned I moved to the UK from this, I had actually been traveling in Europe, visiting different activist projects, seeing what was going on. And I was in Germany at a climate conference, and I just got invited to come along to do an action against Heathrow. Climate change is a crisis. Was the branding for that. You can see in the top right. There's a great video for it put together and a website. And then about 40 people turned out on that day to blockade the road that goes into Heathrow, protesting the expansion there. There's been other actions there. You can see in the bottom right there, there's people locked onto a car, which managed to block the road going to Heathrow for a few hours. We've had flash mobs and yeah, several other things have happened, which we'll come to. But we've not just been focused on Heathrow. We've also done stuff against the financial sector, and specifically its targeting of fracking. We had about a dozen actions going off across the country, including lots of live stream videos, some of which was viewed by tens of thousands of people. Including a rooftop occupation of Barclays. So quite a lot going on there. Moving on, the two pictures on the left here are from the King's College Climate Emergency Campaign, which, wait, did I get that wrong? No, yes, that's right. Which was an 8-week campaign with 8 direct actions in that time, including escalating to a hunger strike. And then managed to get the King's College to accept our demands and give us a full divestment from fossil fuels within 5 years. So a good success there. On the right, you're seeing a campaign that's followed on from that, at the London School of Economics or Exploitation, which it's got gross inequality in the way that it pays its director $500,000 a year and pays its cleaning staff £3 an hour. So there's been more actions there, a whole bunch of them, largely to do around the tactics of using chalk spray. Moving on, we've not just done actions, we've done court support for those of us who got arrested. We've done some work in consultations, you can see in the bottom left there. We've done presentations, we've done webinars, the third one, and we've also had the Rising Up winter gathering and a bit of nature connection going on. That's not a very wintry picture, but with climate change, winter is no longer winter, is it anyway? So yeah, we are prioritizing some of the other things outside of doing actions and trying to create culture. Most recently, we've done some things to highlight how democracy is being faked, how the big media is being incredibly toxic in the sort of attempted brainwashing of the people in this country, and how 80% of the British media is owned by 5 billionaires. And so they've got their interests, which are definitely not in the interest of most of us. So we've been really highlighting that. And all of this has been done in just 8 months, which I think is quite a lot of stuff. There's a lot of energy in this group. And you can see when you get into doing something, just how much just a few people can accomplish. And that allows us to dream big about when more involved, what else can we be doing? Now I'm going to pass it back to Gail, who's going to talk about how things change.
Thanks, Stu. I think one of the reasons we've managed to do so much is because Rising Up runs along very decentralized lines, although there are some people at the centre helping with the website, so there's some centralization. Mostly it's just up to people. If they want to do things, crack on. You can use Rising Up as a kind of umbrella term, as long as you agree with the principles and values that we're living by, which Stu will talk about later. And it's also really worth saying that Barclays Bank announced that they would take their money out of fracking, which felt like a really big win. And that was part of a much wider movement, but we've added in a key ingredient, which is the civil disobedience, which we think is really important and part of how things change. And it was also really interesting that at Heathrow Airport, when people went back and broke bail conditions, that for one person they were fined £20, where we thought that they could even end up in jail. So there seems to be a real understanding out there, at least in some places, and support that understands that actually things don't change without people taking principled stances. So I'm on the slide, how do things change? And it's the miserable bit first for us all, just to remind us of where we're at in the world, that the system that we're living under is so very deeply toxic. I'm just getting a message that my computer's about to restart, so I'm going to get rid of that, and hopefully it won't. Okay, it's really annoying how it does that, sorry. So the system that we're living under, deeply, deeply toxic. It's deadly. The Earth is already in a 6th mass species extinction, and the last time that happened was with the dinosaurs. We've lost half of our wildlife in the last 40 years. It's dangerous. We have the 14 characteristics of fascism alive and getting stronger. It's miserable because of the concentration of wealth in 0.01%, in fact. There's a deep inequality in the world, and that we know through analyses by people like the spirit level folks that this causes deep mental and physical illness in all people, actually, even those that apparently are doing well within this system. Everyone suffers in it. It's corrupt. We have a very particular form of Western collusive corruption. It's not necessarily about bribes. It's more about allowing things to happen, going along with things because somehow you benefit from it. And that very much includes the whole tax haven industry. There's a whole industry of sort of offshoring rules, wealth, regulations, and so on, that if you're rich enough, you can get out of the mainstream. And it's immutable, meaning it just doesn't want to change. Change is unlikely to come from within this system, which doesn't mean that reform's not worth fighting for. But given that the fossil fuel infrastructure already exists to take global temperatures to 3.5 degrees, and we agreed in Paris that we need to keep them at 1.5 degrees, and we're looking for new fossil fuels, it's clear that change is not part of what this system wants to do. Now, when you are faced with this stuff, and I don't want to raise all that miserable stuff to put us into despair, it's just to really face what we're dealing with. It's interesting to note that there are already many really, really good proposals on the table about how to make changes. So I've been involved in the tax justice movement, and things like the tax dodging bill contain very detailed, interesting ways of tackling tax dodging. I mean, you have to be a real wonk to get involved in the details of it, but people know how to deal with that. There's a way of doing regenerative agriculture to capture carbon. Zero Carbon Britain from the Centre for Alternative Technology tells us how to take this country very quickly into a carbon neutral state. And all these things can be debated, but fundamentally proposals are on the table. Polly Higgins has forwarded this amazing ecocide law, which would make people culpable for mass damage and destruction, and also for clearing up when ecocides happen. So there isn't really a strong question about what we should be doing. There's debate within that, sure, but we know what we should be doing. But how do we see that change? You know, how does change actually come about? So if we just move to the next slide, Stu. So it's interesting then, from a perspective of change, to ask what our theory of change is. And there are different theories of change out there, and often we don't realize we're working to a specific theory of change, but there are ones that we favor over other ones. What we've seen from successful movements is that they're the ones that embrace several theories. So the civil rights movement in America and Indian independence as examples use more than one theory at the same time. And because we have this body of research, it's possible to have very holistic and conscious change. So going beyond just doing things to actually thinking about why we're doing things and what we're trying to change as a result, and actually reflecting on whether that's working or not. So to the next slide. So thankfully, Mika White, who was part of the Occupy movement, part of Adbusters, has done his own deep thinking about how do things change. And a rapid change in wealth and power could also be given the word revolution. Some that might inspire people, that might scare people. We're just talking about the quick change that we require. And Mika White said that actually there are 4 different types of change that people really talk about. So one, looking at the bottom right-hand corner there, is structuralism, the idea that you can't make change happen. It's going to be forces outside your own control, but you should be ready for them. You should be ready to do something. And that tends to be more Marxist theory. We also work with Radical Think Tank, and they've set up what they're calling their alternative COBRA committee to look at times when change is possible and to be ready for it. So we ran a picnic, for example, when Brexit happened. We had 1,000 people. And that's why Rising Up has done things around the election, because we recognise that was a moment when people are awake and listening and thinking about how things could change. So it's important to embrace and be ready for changes and look for how we can support that moment. There's a more esoteric thing called theurgism, which is the idea that something outside of everyday reality can provoke change. You could call that divine intervention. And definitely in Rising Up, we're not asking anybody to believe anything that they don't believe in. Some of us do have spiritual practices and are open to, if you like, magic, prayer and ceremony. And if nothing else, you could look at how that might influence your thinking on a sort of neuro-linguistic programming front or whatever. There could be some science behind this, is all I'm trying to say. And I am actually a scientist in training, so I'm not up for just believing things randomly. That kind of stuff has been more embraced by activists in recent years. You've seen it in particular at the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, because it was led by people of native indigenous traditions. You've had pagans working against fracking. There are interfaith prayer vigils at things like the climate talks and so on, Muslims against climate action. So we're just wanting to say, look, let's not reject that idea, because if nothing else, it's a coming together when you really set your collective intention, and actually possibly it is a really useful thing to be doing as well. Subjectivism is the idea that we need to change our own inner reality. We have to do inner work. So this idea that external reality is a manifestation of the pain and suffering that we're carrying, and that if we do enough inner work, we're going to see a big change in the world. And this is the kind of reason why people do meditations or nature connection work. Charles Eisenstein talks about a new story of the people. And again, in Rising Up, we're very much behind this idea, that we need to really focus on who we are, that we can't just be fighting some external system, that actually the way we interact with each other is really important. And but I guess we do sit most strongly in the 4th quadrant, which is called voluntarism, the idea that we can collectively assert our will. I'm really sorry about that with the phone, excuse me. And by doing that, we can create models that if we get enough people doing that, it scales up. And there are different versions of that. So some people, you know, the big focus is on voting, and we think we've got a rigged democracy. We still think it's useful to vote. I don't want to speak for everybody in Rising Up, but that's one way. For some people, it's conscious change. You know, it's about what you do in your own life, how do you consume, and so on. How do we educate children? It may be about creating new ways of doing things, so new ways of doing agriculture, for example, permaculture, making sure that that's in place. And it can be tactics within a campaign where you're trying to change the system as it is, trying to stop it from doing a thing. So there are lots of things within voluntarism, but it needs a collective program, and at least on some way, when you're designing new ways of doing things like new education systems, you're holding a space for the future. And so just to summarize that slide, all of those are of interest, and we have our mind set on them all within Rising Up. Next slide, please. So what's really interesting is within this theory of change, is to talk about power. So we talk about love within Rising Up as well, that things need to come from your heart, and we need to feel our power. And I think that's something that's really happened in this recent election as well. We often think of power as lying at Westminster or in corporations or in the media, but there's a strong part of political theory that suggests that power lies in the collective. Jean Sharp, Hannah Arendt talk about that. And in fact, there's been a detailed study, and there is a list of all the research online in Rising Up under More and Rising Up Resources, some key texts you can find there, that shows that for system change, you only need 3.5%, and it can be less than that, to rise up to demand that change. So when people get frightened and say, gosh, how are we ever going to change the Daily Mail readers? It's not actually those folks that we need to engage. It's those people that are ready for change that need to come together and rise up together. In the UK, it's about 2.2 million people, and I believe that many people already exist who want to see change. It's not that we want to ignore the Daily Mail readers. We want to make them feel safe and loved and so on, but we don't need them in active participation, but we do need 3.5% in active participation. Not everybody needs to be doing the same thing in that active participation. For some people, it'll be supporting social media. For others, it'll be helping on actions behind the scenes with kind of movement care things. For some people, it will be frontline activist type of confrontations. So another piece of the theory of change is that things change when the 4 C's happen, that you raise consciousness about an issue, you coordinate and work together, you know what change you want to see. So when you've got the moment of change, you can consolidate it, you can put the proposal on the table. But the key ingredient that tends to have been missing in the last few years in a sector that's been dominated by NGOs who need to play it safe a lot of the time is the confrontation stage, is the stage where you say, we're not having this, this is not okay. And civil disobedience and civil resistance have been a huge part of change throughout the world. They're key to change. National parks and your right to roam came through mass trespassers. The vote that we have via the Chartists and the suffragettes came through significant acts of civil disobedience. We know all about the Boston Tea Party. You may have heard of the Tolpuddle Martyrs. There's the strikes, Luddite uprising, poll tax, fight backs from as long ago as the Peasant Revolt to the 1980s with Thatcher. The prevention of GM in the UK involved people pulling up GM crops in 1999. DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts, currently do acts of civil disobedience. So the tradition carries on. And as Scandi said, it's a sacred duty. We're not asking everybody who participates in Rising Up to undertake acts of civil disobedience, but we are saying that we want you to support that as part of the need for change. That's going to be something that some of us need to do. And we would actually encourage everybody to look inside themselves and ask whether it is the right time for them to participate in that. For some people, it won't be, you know, if that would affect your mental health, if you're a carer, if you're from another country, it may not be the right thing for you, and you need to make your own judgment on that. So we can be conscious about change. I'm looking at the next slide here, Stu. And one of the things that's useful is to have a hybrid model where we do a mixture between what's called structure-based organising and mass protest. Just going to get rid of that. I won't get into the detail of that, but one part of that really is basically about mixing in this idea of huge protests with also doing grassroots building, involving people in the kind of rising up concept. So that's what we're trying to do. And it's important in doing that to make our culture explicit. So we've had training from the INI Institute, from Carlos Saavedra, who's from an American guy originally from Peru, who talks about what your movement DNA is, being really clear about that. So a bit like the Occupy movement, it had a name, it had a story, which was we are the 1%, and it had a tactic, which was to occupy. In that way, it was probably too narrow and it was easy to get rid of, because once you got rid of occupations, you got rid of the whole thing. So it's good to have more tactics. So what they encourage at the INE Institute is for us to say what your story is, your strategy and your structure, and to ensure that people understand that. Now, we're not going to be able to do that in detail today, but fundamentally our story is one that says we have a toxic culture, we can change it, there are things that can be done, there are policies out there. We have a strategy that involves looking at the pillars that hold the system in place, the media, the finance sector, and the fact we have a fake democracy. They need pointing out, as well as doing actions around symptoms of the system. And we need to keep saying that the system that we live under is toxic and it affects all of us. And these things are written up. And again, if you go to RisingUp's web page and you go under, and I think the link will be on this later, you go under more and Rising Up resources, there's a lot more written up there. We keep refining and changing these things, so the latest will be uploaded at some point, but we have done some deep thinking about that. This is the main thing to say. And we have a decentralized structure, so people can have their own local Rising Up group in the same way that Occupy groups spread around. You don't need anybody's permission. You just need to follow our principles and values, which Stuart will talk about. We're looking at momentum escalation. That's best worked so far at the King's College, where divestment was achieved, which is basically about doing an action, letting people know who you are off the back of that, and training people in what you're about so that they feel like they can participate. And then there's new participants, and then you can make the thing bigger. We want to embody a regenerative culture in our principles and values. And again, more from Stu, but that's about nobody's to blame, movement care, love and gratitude, reverence for nature, looking after each other, thinking about inclusion, thinking about power and privilege and self-care and so on. And it's also about authenticity, isn't it? It's about having fun. Nobody's going to be interested in doing this thing if it's all just hard work and kind of earnest, angry sort of activism. We're also trying to practice new forms of democracy. So we're wanting to decentralize power, as I've said, that you can do Rising Up from wherever you're based. You can call your thing Rising Up, feel free. You can take the logo off the website and so on. You can be autonomous. We're using things like holacracy, which is going beyond consensus. So we don't all sit in a room for hours deciding what we're going to do. We just, a few of us decide autonomously that we want to do something, see who else is interested, and then you agree on jobs, and whoever's agreed to do a job, say, for example, somebody's writing a press release, that they are empowered to do that. They don't need the group's permission. They would best get advice and feedback from a couple of people, and they're responsible for how well that goes. So, you know, there's responsibility, but just trying to stop the kind of clogging that can happen when everything has to be agreed by everybody. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've got so much done in 8 months. We're also looking at rotation and sortation, and sorry for all the jargon, but they're just basically ways of allowing people to be involved centrally. There's a small amount of centralization because we have a database and a website and so on. And if people want to get involved in that, come to our summer gathering, and we'll be talking more about how to be part of sort of some of the centralized functions, so they are explained transparently and people can get involved. So just moving on to the next slide here about tactics. One of the things that has to happen to see change is polarising the public and winning active support for an aim. And you can see that in Heathrow in particular, for example, that people will, you do an action, and as a result of doing an action that may lead to arrest and may lead to disruption, that people talk about what you're doing. So at Heathrow, you know, none of us love the fact that sticking a car in a tunnel meant that some people missed their flight. You know, we're sorry about that. That's not cool. We don't like that. However, we see the bigger picture of air pollution and climate change and know that we cannot have it that this system just decides there's a third runway and is just going to ignore all the fight backs against that. And frankly, it's a very anti-democratic process. People have voted against the third runway on many fronts, voted for people against it, and still they're getting it. So the disruption's important, and it doesn't matter to some extent that people don't like the disruption. It matters that they're having a conversation about the thing that you care about. That kind of approach has probably best been done by ACT UP, who focused on getting good treatment around AIDS and gay marriage and so on. And they did very disruptive actions. And again, people said, we disagree with your method, but not the message. And the message got through and the changes got made. I had a friend who worked on a peace scarf action where a 7-mile peace scarf was taken to the place where nuclear weapons are in the UK, around Aldermaston. It involved 25 years of knitting, and it got very, very little coverage. And I often use that as a sad example of how things can be ignored if there isn't a confrontational element to it. And it's not to say that that didn't have any value in terms of how it brought people together, and it did get some coverage, but it just shows you the power of disruptive and sacrificial actions where people are willing to be arrested. Another thing that's really important are dilemma actions, where you kind of basically put the authorities on the back foot. You do an action that means that whatever the authorities do, they're going to look a little bit daft. So in the Serbian Revolution, for example, they wrote anti-Slobodan Milosevic slogans on little ping pong balls. And in Belgrade, they've got lots of steps, and they go to the top of the steps and they pour these balls down the steps. And the authorities would either have to leave these little balls bouncing around everywhere with these anti-dictator slogans on, or look really stupid, kind of racing around trying to catch them and pick them up. In the Dreamers movement, undocumented migrants in the States, what they did there was to offer themselves in service. So for undocumented migrants have been scapegoated heavily in the States as being rapists, drug dealers, and so on. And a bit like in the gay rights movement, people came out and said, look, we're actually the mother of your child's best friend, and so on, we're good people. And they offered blood. They offered a day of service where they were going to give blood. And either the authorities had to let that happen and therefore quite rightly legitimise these people's rights to be in the country where they live, or to arrest people trying to give blood. And what they actually did was to let them do it, and that really solidified the movement. So dilemma actions can be very powerful, and we've been using them in Rising Up, especially with chalk spray. It cleans off afterwards. It doesn't leave a big mess, but it gets our message across. We also use conditional commitment on the website, which is to build numbers, asking if people can commit to do something, if other people will do it. And we're trying to design inclusive actions. This is really important. So it's kind of like a curve, basically, where a few people are willing to do high-risk things and other people are willing to do what we might call peaceful mischief. So, for example, if you hid newspapers in a newsagent, in a supermarket, it's not really illegal. I'm sure the supermarket don't want you to do it, but you're not particularly taking a great risk. That's still something bigger than, say, signing a petition. So these are ways of, so when we do an action, so when we did Heathrow, we also had a communications blockade you could join where you could phone up Heathrow Airport. We've done it for Quadrilla the Frackers too. So there's a way in which you can join an action and participate, but you're not the person blocking the tunnel, that kind of thing. So it's a way of making sure we can all participate, and that's a really important part of the tactics. And it's just good just to finish there, just to ask yourself again, what are you up for? And quite often, you know, you start off with something small like hiding the newspapers, and before you know it, you'll know, like myself, recently going down to Murdoch's place and spray chalking his building and risking arrest. And there are even more higher risk things that we may well do beyond that. So I think handing back to Stu, I'll just check if there's been any questions. That's fine.
All right, thank you very much, Gail. So I'm going to take us through principles and values, and these are still a work in progress, a discussion that's actively happening. We had some initial principles and values drawn up about a year ago, but now we're trying to get them to go a little bit deeper and fit them to the Rising Up, the group and the mentality a little bit more closely. So this first one, we have a shared vision of change, creating a world that is fit for the next 7 generations to live in. Many of us have come from a place of anger and yet found that anger doesn't sustain us, nor does it inform us of the world that we're trying to build. So in Rising Up, we try to work from a place of engagement in the world, imagining the future possibilities we want to create, and then sharing that excitement with others. Number 2, we set our mission on what is necessary, as Gail mentioned, mobilizing 3.5% of the population to achieve system change. No regime in the 20th century managed to stand against an uprising, where with that 3.5% active participation of the population. And yeah, as I mentioned as well, this would mean mobilizing around 2 million people in Britain in order to see that rapid change in wealth distribution and power structures, preventing the rich elite from perpetuating their self-serving ideology. We need a regenerative culture, creating a culture which is healthy, resilient, and adaptable. When people are feeling safe, we're typically more able to take larger risks. Feeling safe brings courage. So Rising Up is trying to build a regenerative culture where people are looked after. Too many of us have experienced burnout, having been involved in groups where the culture is focused on go, 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 and action after action. And we don't want to perpetuate that cycle. So in Rising Up, we're prioritizing self-care, action care, as in caring for people taking actions, into personal care and community care. Number 4, we openly challenge ourselves and this toxic system, leaving our comfort zones to take action for change. We do this as above ground groups, i.e. we're not doing covert stuff and then running away and hiding. Our civil disobedience is intended as a bold challenge to the system as it stands. And so when we do an action, we take responsibility for it. And then a result of this is that people admire the courage that we take and are drawn to it. I'll just lay out that there's 10 principles and values. So as we count through them, we're up to 5 now. We value reflecting and learning. That's following a cycle of action, reflection, learning, and planning for more action. Learning from other movements and contexts as well as our own experiences. We don't know how things will change, and so we're willing to experiment and learn from what we do and what others do around the world. This is an active and ongoing process requiring time and input from individuals and groups to think about what has gone well and why, and what would be better to be done differently. Number 6, we welcome everyone and every part of everyone, working actively to create safer and more accessible spaces. We recognize that in order to change the world, we must change the way we think about and form relationships with those we work and ally with. The world is currently defined by multiple and compounded layers of oppression. Our goal is to welcome every individual, regardless of ethnicity, race, class, gender identity, gender presentation, sexuality, age, income, ability, education, appearance, immigration status, belief or non-belief, activist experience, and on and on. We create the safer spaces we need to work actively to continuously build understandings of how these hierarchies operate so that we can challenge them and build inclusion through making our spaces more accessible. Therefore, for our movement to be safe for everyone, it needs to be safe for the most marginalized. We also recognize that we're complex beings and are a work in progress, and so try to approach each other from a place of compassion and understanding. Number 7, we actively mitigate the power, breaking down hierarchies of power for more equal participation. This goes into a little bit of what Gail's already said. The ground on which this network stands is on relationships between its participants. We all work every day to build trust, respect, and reciprocity among all of us. We assume all our members have good intentions and will react against disrespect. We ground our work in dialogue, healing, collective transformation, and justice. We aim to center the voices that are normally the most marginalized by allowing space for them to speak and encouraging those who normally wouldn't take leadership or coordination positions to do so. And we have mechanisms in place to try to ensure that power doesn't become too concentrated or entrenched. Number 8, we avoid blaming and shaming. We live in a toxic system, but no one individual is to blame. Blaming and shaming will not serve us in the long run. Whilst a specific campaign may seek to highlight a damaging role played by an institution, including individuals serving that institution, our starting point is that we live in a toxic system that has damaged everybody. We can point out behavior that is unhelpful, exploitative, or abusive, and we won't tolerate such behavior. Yet we don't hand away our love or power by blaming and shaming. This is also true in our interpersonal and group dynamics, as well as our relationships to ourselves. We're a non-violent network, using non-violent strategy and tactics as the most effective way to bring about change. All of those 20th century movements that got the 3.5% mobilization were non-violent. The non-violent movements in the 20th century performed better in terms of achieving success and resilience, typically creating deeper and longer lasting changes than the violent movements. So strategically, it makes sense for us to be non-violent. Non-violence also keeps our movement alive, being more attractive to many, and enables us to be consistent in our approach to each other and to our opponents. Disciplined non-violence can effectively expose the real perpetrators of violence, and so help to win the public over more easily, allowing us to achieve our goals. However, we do not condemn those who justly use violence to protect themselves. And finally, number 10, we are based on autonomy and decentralization. We collectively create the structures we need to challenge power. Anyone who follows these core principles and values can take action in the name of rising up. That means that we don't have to ask permission from anybody at Rising Up in order to do something. What we need to do is measure whether our intentions and our actions fit with these 10 principles and values. If they do, then you're welcome to go ahead and do those actions in the name of Rising Up. Okay, I'm going to pass back to Gail to talk about how you can get involved.
Thanks, Stu. We did have viewer 38 asking to speak, so maybe just while I'm talking about how you can get involved, the next 2 slides, and then anybody else who wants to speak, let us know in the chat channel and we'll try and unmute you and get your questions, or you can also type in your questions. So how can you get involved? Post-consensus, as Stu just said, you can just crack on and do stuff if you agree with the principles and values, and you can read more online and just check out the other stuff that we've been posting on Facebook and in YouTube channel Rising Up and so on, to see if you're agreeing with where we're coming from, basically. So join on the website for newsletters, and there are also pledges. So part of that conditional commitment, I will if you will, that you can sign. We're very much wanting to focus nationally on the media. You can do local actions here in Stroud. We're going to be focusing on a local incinerator issue as well. But the media feels like something we'd like to take on nationally with a series of actions. So if you're on your own in the location, is there a mate you could join up with? It's almost always fun to do things in pairs or in threes at least. We're really happy to help with anything that we can. I mean, we're a small bunch of volunteers, but we can potentially come and do a workshop at your place if you can get a group of people together. If you want to get more involved, you can join on our base camp, send us an email. There might be a local group near you or some people near you, so that's the list of where we know there are people. And then on the next slide, there's some dates. I think that the Oxford date's going to change, but there is a Bristol meeting in June. I'll be down in Brighton in July. and things coming up again, dates to be confirmed in Manchester and Liverpool, and keep an eye out on events. So yeah, let's move over to questions and answers. If you're on this webinar at the minute and you just want to say hi, or you're interested but you need some help, or you want to tell us what you're doing, go ahead, or if you've got any questions.
And just before we open it up for Q&A, I think we're going to say goodbye to the people who have watched this as a recording. If you'd like to participate in future webinars and join the Q&A section, then there will be future webinars, hopefully, where you can do so. But we'll leave the Q&A after the recording.
Thank you.
So goodbye to those folks.